Chapter 1. Just 3 months had passed since the horrific night that changed the Mason and Drake families forever. From the walk to the lodge to the capture of the assailants had taken all of 6 hours. The 6 hours had been the longest 6 hours of their lives. Sue Drake was now 4.5 months pregnant with Paul's child, and every day she wondered if Paul was watching her from up above. She truly believed in heaven and God and was sure that Paul was with him right now. Paul Sr. had taken over the Paul Drake Detective Agency once again. He found that although he was a little rusty, he was still very good at his job and had adjusted well as far as that was concerned. Jen had been staying at Sue's house for the first few weeks trying to help her adjust. Sue had told them that she was pregnant and they had wanted to protect that unborn child at any cost. Della was adjusting to life without Paul and had to learn to live with the fact that she had murdered a man. Oh, yes, there had been no charges. He had his gun and had already killed at the very least Mark Washington. But she had to learn to live with the expression on the man's face as he went down after she had shot him. He had been less than 10 feet from her and he had died immediately. But the trial of the century was about to begin and she was finding herself on the other side of the table. She was going to be a witness, as was her husband, in a multiple murder trial. Never in her life had she been at such odds with her thoughts within. Perry had dedicated his life to finding out what the truth was, and he was not going to allow his best friend to die in vain. He was determined to find out why these 2 men had committed such a crime and who was involved, who was the ringleader. These 2 men were the shooters, but he knew that someone was pulling the strings and he was going to find out who. The investigation had begun immediately and had never ceased. Perry had found Paul's father a dependable, smart man who knew the ins and outs of private investigation. He might be a little emotionally involved as Perry was, but he had kept a level head during the entire ordeal. When Perry had come home to find Della and his family and friends in his little pool house hiding from the murderer, something had snapped. For the first and last time he was going to allow this to happen. He had done his best to get Della to stay home and retire from the dangerous business, but she had refused. She had gone with him the very next morning. His partner, wife, and love, was next to him ready to find out the who and whys. He had hugged her and off they had gone to the lodge. The police were there still and Della walked through the hall very carefully. She was fresh and had not been in before. Her experience in doing so many investigations was now kicking in. She combed each and every corner of the room. She found that the police had done a very thorough investigation on the inside. So, she decided to go to the outside where 2 police officers had been killed. Perry watched as his wife walked around the room, but he had another angle in mind. He headed to the office. In the office he found the club secretary Terry Wallace. Terry was a woman of around 40, with a strong, kind manner. She had been the secretary for 5 years. She was sitting at the desk going over the paperwork that the police had. It was obvious that she had been crying and Perry felt very sorry for the friend who had been destroyed as he had just the night before. Terry Wallace was trying to get her desk together when she heard the steps of another person. Everyone had been demanding this and that of her and she hadn't had the answers. She was destroyed. The night before, all the friends that she had socialized all her adult life with had either been permanently emotionally scarred or were dead. She had looked up to find her friend Perry Mason. Immediately Terry smiled. She knew that Perry was who she really needed at that moment. He was an attorney and a good one. He would know what papers the police could demand and give her some needed legal advice. "Perry, I am just lost. I am so sorry about Paul. The police want all the records of the lodge and I just don't know." Perry smiled down at his friend and said what they need is anything that might lead to the ringleader. Someone planned the entire thing. I don't, and neither do the police, think that it was them or Mark Washington. Someone contacted the newspapers, the demonstrators, and someone paid these men to do the shooting. My job is to find out who it was and make sure that they face a court of law. Give them anything that you have. Do you mind if I look? Immediately, Terry felt a speck of relief. She had been overwhelmed by the task. She had been up on the stage when the shooting had started. Fortunately for her, she had been at the podium when it had started. The podium had provided a shelter for her. But, through a pinhole in the woodwork, she had seen the whole thing. She would never get over it. If she hadn't been reading the minutes, she could have been seated in plain view. Everyone on the stage had been shot but her that evening. She smiled and pushed her chair back. "Please help yourself." As Perry took a seat at her desk, he opened the folder. There were hundreds of papers, but Terry was very proficient and he saw that everything, but the information from the night of the shooting, was on the hard drive of the lodge computer. All he would need was the password and he would have all the information that he needed. Quickly he wrote down every single piece of information that had been written the night of the shooting and anything from that day. He would investigate everything piece by piece. Della had been around the dumpster in the back once more, when she had seen Terry go out the back door. She had watched as the lady put something in her car. In the car, she was putting a folder. Della watched her, careful to make sure that she wasn't seen. After a few moments Terry had gone back into the lodge and Della walked around the front. She approached the lodge office and saw her husband and Terry. She walked in the room and smiled as she greeted the two. "I thought that I might find you here at the lodge." Perry knew that this meant his wife had something she wanted to tell him and he smiled. As he gave his wife a hug she gave him the look that told him she wanted to keep him busy until she came back. He couldn't help but wonder what his wife was up to. But he said, "Why don't you go and call Karen and let her know that you'll be gone for more than a short while? Terry is showing me the minutes and I will be a while." Della read the signal and headed out of the lodge. She took out her camera and quick lock release for the car door and headed out to Terry's car. If luck was with her, Terry would have no idea that she had seen anything. Chapter 2. The criminals had been captured, at least the shooters. One was dead and the other safely in jail. Fortunately, bail had been denied. Hamilton Berger sat at his large desk looking over paper after paper on what had been found out about the men who had caused so many deaths in such a short time. As the district attorney he had thought he had seen it all. He had seen families, spouses, children and random murders, but never such a large senseless crime as this. George Ramsey was going to be prosecuted last. His first case was going to involve the prosecution of the protesters. They had a good attorney and most had been arrested before. He opened the folder and began to look into the lady that had been the organizer of the protest. He had in front of him all the arrest records of Mary Pierce. She had been arrested over 20 times and at the very least she had been lucky. As the district attorney he had been lenient, too lenient on protesters. Now, he was facing a challenge. Should he name Mary Pierce as one of those involved in the slaughter at the lodge? She certainly had been an instigator and he decided that it was time to call her down to his office for another interview. After spending many hours, too many she felt, Mary Pierce had been released from jail by a judge this time. There had been no bond or personal that had allowed her to leave within hours. But, never had there been any violence near to what had happened that night and she had not been released on her own this time. She knew she was in trouble. When bail had been set at $10,000 that had been the beginning of real trouble in her mind. She had just stepped into the shower when the phone rang and it was Hamilton Berger. He wanted to see her in his office. She was going to have to call her attorney again. Lori Platt had heard of the terror at the lodge and now Della was on the phone. The news was the worst news that she had ever heard. Oh, she knew that what her sister did was dangerous sometimes and the thought of her being hurt had always been a worry of hers, but this. She had seen the news and had known of the many dead, but they hadn't given any names until family had been notified. Paul may not be a relative, but he had been a part of her life for years and he and Sue and Paul had been over to their house so many times that she couldn't count them. He had died a hero and her sister and Perry were finding out exactly what had happened. As Mike came into the kitchen he saw the look on his wife's face and just took her in his arms. As she tearfully told him what had happened he took a deep breath. Although he wasn't as close to Paul as Perry was, he had been a friend of his for over 6 years. It had been Paul's investigation that had helped find the real killer when he had been accused so many years ago. Paul had been to his home so many times and him to his, he just couldn't imagine what poor Sue and Paul Jr. were going through. The criminals had been captured, at least the shooters. One was dead and the other safely in jail. Fortunately, bail had been denied. Hamilton Berger sat at his large desk looking over paper after paper on what had been found out about the men who had caused so many deaths in such a short time. After spending many hours, too many she felt, Mary Pierce had been released from jail by a judge this time. There had been no bond or personal this time. She knew she was in trouble. Then the phone rang and it was Hamilton Berger. He wanted to see her in his office. She was going to have to call her attorney again. As he pulled from his wife just a few inches he looked at her with love. "Come on, Lori. Let's get dressed and go over to Sue's and see if we can be of any help," he told her. Karen looked out of her bedroom window and cried. She thought of how selfish she was to cry for herself. But, it wasn't for herself, it was for everyone. Paul had died, but she, Della and the 3 children came within moments of being murdered themselves. She had never been so close to losing everyone that mattered to her. If it hadn't been for Della's bravery, they could have all been killed. The police were still out at the pool house and she knew that they would be a while. As she went down the stairs she saw Sally sitting at her window watching the police. She was sitting there just staring and jumped when Karen came into the room. Karen smiled at her and said, "Come on with me. The police have to do their job and we're safe. Let's go get some breakfast, your mom called. She's on her way back home." Sally gave her nanny her best smile. It wasn't easy as she kept remembering that awful man with the gun. But Karen had grabbed all three of the kids and put them behind her. She had put their lives first and it had made her love her even more. "Let's go make mommy her favorite breakfast, bacon and eggs with home fries. I want to help." Karen smiled and gave her a kiss on the head. She was a trooper, no doubt about it. As the two walked towards Perry Jr.'s room they were met by him already dressed. "I want to help make mommy's breakfast too," he said. The three went down the stairs, a new beginning. All would be well in the Mason house, Sally knew it. Perry was still at the lodge with Terry Wallace. He went through paper after paper and got a copy of the video of the shooting. The video was quite good but had no sound. That was all right because he wasn't sure that he was ready to hear all the screaming. However, he did think of something. The words that were said could be important. Terry Wallace was watching the man that she admired. He was smart and determined. His best friend had been killed and she knew that he would leave no stone unturned in his search for the truth. She had managed to get the folder, her personal folder, out of the office before Perry had found it. She knew that fooling Perry Mason was next to impossible and she might have made a bad mistake in hiding it. But she had her own reason for doing it and she was sure nothing in there had anything to do with the murder. Paul Sr. had another plan in his mind. He knew that there was someone else involved. He wanted to find out more about the protesters and their background. He felt that even if they were not directly involved in the shooting, someone had been in contact with or without their knowledge with the ringleader. As he headed out of his son's house he headed to the newspaper office. He would find everything he could and speak to the reporters. He still had a friend who worked there, Sean Sullivan. As he walked into the office Sean met him. Chapter 4. Dave Mason had spent another sleepless night worrying about Perry. He couldn't help but notice the news and he just wanted to know that everyone was all right. Just by the grace of God he had been away on business or he could have been there that night. Then the pictures of his brother's home and the shooting. No experience in one's lifetime can prepare a parent or friend for what the streets and the Masons woke up to that morning. Each one of the families had resigned themselves to the knowledge that the work that their children did was dangerous. But this was too much. The terror at the lodge had been a nightmare come true, and then as if the situation couldn't get any worse it had. Della's parents had barely gone to bed when the phone rang. It had been Della. She wanted to let them know that she and the children were all right. All right? How could that be? A man had broken into their pool house where they had been hiding and attempted to murder them. They had run from their home in the middle of the night and hidden while waiting for the police to arrive. Well, they were sure that the police came as quickly as they could, but they hadn't been fast enough. The man had gotten into the pool house and aimed a gun at their daughter and grandchildren. Now, Della had to live with the fact that she had killed, even if it was in self-defense, for the rest of her life. What could they do? What could they say to comfort their daughter, their grandchildren, their son-in-law? Now, the streets were on the phone listening as they heard of the heroism of Paul Drake. Paul had been a good friend to their daughter. They loved Sue and her son Paul Jr. They had met them on several occasions and Della had always spoken fond of the family. Della's mom cried as she packed her suitcase. They were on their way to LA once again. Their daughter needed them as did her whole family. Dave did not need a call from his brother. He was on his way to his brother's home to do what he could to be of assistance. This was his brother's family and best friend and he was sure that even his brother had been taken by surprise. Finally, Della had made her way back home. The last 24 hours had been the worst 24 hours of her life. She had lost her friend and she had committed an act that had resulted in the death of a man. There was no rationalizing what had happened. Paul was dead, her friend Sue was a widow and Paul Jr. no longer had a father. What about her children and Karen? They surely had to have been affected by what they had seen. She was not sure of how much Perry Jr. had understood, but he certainly had been traumatized as well. Sam Rogers had been at the pool house when he had seen his father shot and killed by Mrs. Mason. Life had been so different for him. His father was not the best father in the world, but he had been his dad. Now, he was in the middle of his front lawn. The news people from all around the country were there and they all wanted to talk to Sam and his mother. Joni Rogers saw her world fall apart. No more normal for her or her son. As she stood on the lawn smoking like a chimney and crying her heart out. Her husband was dead and her son almost one of his victims. Elle think OMG police officer after police officer arrived and came into her home. They took everything that her husband had in his office. She watched in horror as even his clothes were taken out. The police had been very thorough in their search and had kept her at the police station for most of the night. But, her son, Sam, so tall and so grown up. He was just 13 and his father had aimed a gun at him. She or Sam would never know whether or not he would have killed him and the others because Della Street had shot and killed him. The poor woman had saved her son's life and she would forever be grateful. If he had killed them she could have been next for all she knew. She hugged her son tightly as those thoughts terrorized her. She was in no condition to do anything, but watch the police do their work. She wanted them to find out the truth. She had nothing to do with any of this. Della was sure that she did not have any appetite, but when she saw Sally and Perry setting up a plate for her at the table she put on her best face. The food did smell delicious and she needed to eat. Sally was such a strong person, there were no signs of any emotion on her face. As a matter of fact, she was smiling and being cheerful. Della gave her children and Karen all a big hug. With a good breakfast in her, Della headed into the office to take a look at the folder that she had photocopied from the car that morning. As she waited for each photo to transfer to her computer, she put her head in her hands and cried. It just hadn't been right and it was time for her to start investigating. Della finally had downloaded the papers when she heard the front door open. She knew that her husband was home and she couldn't be happier. That will never happen again for Sue, she thought to herself, and a tear rolled down her cheek once more. Perry had finished at the lodge and had headed home. One thing he knew about his wife was that from the signals he had been giving him she had something on her mind that she wanted no one else to know about. He was thrilled to see his children run and greet him at the door. But, there was no denying what had happened at his home the night before. The police were there and he needed to check with them once he had spoken to Della. As he looked up, his wife came around the corner. She had been in the office and she was smiling. At this point Perry's curiosity was getting the better of him. He knew Della had something to show him. But, Sally insisted that he have something to eat before he went to work, in truth being told he was hungry. Sally was a good cook and as he ate his eggs and pancakes he smiled at his daughter. How lucky a man I am. 2 of the world's best children, a loving wife, and it could be gone in a second. It is time for me to go back to work. He kissed his 2 children and walked with Della back to the office. Chapter 4, Chapter 5. Nothing would make Perry Mason happier than to be able to solve this crime immediately. But, he was not going to go at this investigation like a bull in a china shop. No, he was going to use his brilliant mind, be methodical and logical. As he walked into the office he saw what Della had been signaling to him earlier. There on his desk was a pile of papers all awaiting his investigative mind. He looked at his wife and took her in his arms. The warmth of her body and the smell of her perfume and self just made him want to stay in this moment forever. But, it was time for him to go to work and he said, "Okay, what is all this?" Della smiled at her husband and said, "I guess it's not a good idea to try to hide a folder from your office without making sure that someone didn't see you." With that Perry smiled and sat down at his big oak desk and took his first glance at the folder before him. What could be in this folder that was so important to Terry Wallace that she had removed it and hid it in her car? That was their job and he and Della were up to the task. As the 2 friends delved into what was a possible clue to the identity of the ringleader, Paul Drake Sr. was now at the newspaper office and going through years of demonstrations and information on the abortion rights laws, and most particularly the demonstrations both recent and from as far back as he was going to be able to find. Sean Sullivan was a seasoned reporter and had covered many demonstrations on abortions and many other issues. He had many years of experience with all kinds of demonstrations. He was sure that this demonstration had something to do with the death of all the people at the lodge. He was busy going over his many files. Fortunately everything was on microfilm and the 2 men found themselves entranced with the amount of information that was forthcoming. The demonstrations had not only become more and more intense, but more and more organized. Mary Pierce had become the leader of many demonstrations and to be able to identify each and every event that happened in and around the city. She seemed to have an uncanny ability to know where anything was going on. Yes, some of the information was in the news or on the television, but most of the information was given out after the event, not before. In the past 5 years she had been at over 100 events in LA alone. Time after time they found no reference to the events before the demonstration had been made in the newspaper. How did she know? As the two men dug deeper, they knew that they were on the right path. Gladys Livingstone had always considered herself a good attorney. However, this was a mass murder and her clients were facing major felonies, possible murder charges, and she had no experience in the field. She had managed to get Mary Pierce out on bail, but she was in deep trouble. She needed the best investigator that she knew. As Gladys and Mary headed towards the district attorney's office, Gladys advised her client to be honest and forthcoming. This is murder, mass murder, and the district attorney is threatening you with accessory. Mary Pierce had been doing nothing but thinking about the shooting since she had heard the sound of the first shot. Yes, she had been a determined woman, and yes, she had crossed the line once or twice, but never like this. She had done her best to stay clear from any violence. I don't know. I just don't know, she said. How do you find out about where to go to hold these demonstrations? Gladys asked her. Mary was well aware of her dilemma, and she knew that if she wanted to save herself she was going to have to confide in someone. But, she had always heard of different places and the happenings through the news and word of mouth. She had several people who were strongly opposed to abortion. But, once in a while she would get an anonymous call. The man disguised his voice and gave very specific instructions. The man had called that morning warning her not to tell anyone about anything, to keep her cool or else. Mary had been frightened by this call. She had looked at her caller ID and called the number back, but the recording said it was a non-working number. As Gladys listened to her client tell her the story of the man and the voice, she knew that her client was indeed in danger. Someone thought that she might have information that they didn't want anyone to know. Mary, I think that we should look into getting you some kind of protection. I don't want you to panic, but whoever called you has ties to a mass murder, and I think you are in danger. I can't run away, my family, they would also be in. I will tell the district attorney all I know. I have no idea who the man is on the phone. The two women walked to the building that housed the district attorney's office. They knew that what happened there would make a difference in both of their lives. Hamilton Berger was pleased that Mary Pierce had agreed to come and meet with him. Tomorrow morning was going to be the hearing for the accused shooter that had survived the carnage. He wanted to be prepared for court with a good load of ammunition, and Mary Pierce could provide him with priceless information. Della and Perry smiled as they went through the folder piece by piece. Of all things, this lady, the lady who had been such a quiet, reserved lady, was having an affair. Paper after paper of love and hope that had begun just 1 month ago was in the folder. The descriptive language and the preserved flowers were among the things that they found. But, nowhere was the identity of the man named. After looking at paper after paper, though, something caught Perry's interest, and as he handed the paper over to Della she nodded. It was information on the vote in her lover's distaste for the abortion issue. Her lover was deeply devout in his belief that all abortions were murder. They would have to keep their eyes peeled on their friend at the lodge. Both Della and Perry wanted to know who this man was. Could he be the key? They had now placed him on their list of person of interest. Tomorrow morning was going to be the hearing for George Ramsey. He was sure that the judge was going to refuse him bail, and Perry wanted to talk to him first. With his wife by his side, Perry and Della Mason headed the familiar route to the police station. They were there to speak to George Ramsey. Chapter 5, Chapter 6. 1 Again Mary Pierce moved in her seat. Yes, she was uncomfortable here in Berger's office. She watched as he took a seat behind his desk and looked into her eyes. I am here to learn anything that you know. I am looking into anyone who could have any information on who was behind this slaughter. I know that you have been involved in many demonstrations over the past few years and must have heard something from someone, he said to her, and then sat back and waited for her response. Once again Mary looked straight at the man that could possibly help her. She spoke slowly as she revealed something that she had told no one, including her lawyer. I am going to entrust you with some information that I truly hope you can help me with. You see, about 3 months ago I started getting some very threatening phone calls and letters. She opened her purse and handed the letters that she had received. One note she found on her way to the district attorney's office inside her locked car. Hamilton watched as she handed the letters to him. Carefully he picked them up by the corner, trying to save any possible fingerprints. He was pretty sure that there would not be much to work with as Mary had been carrying them in her purse, but still, he was interested. You said that you found it in your locked car? Are you sure that it was locked? With earnest in her voice she told him. Yes, I am sure. I am as sure of that as I am sure that 2 of the letters were found in my locked home on my kitchen table when I awoke in the morning. This was very interesting. Someone was trying to frighten Mary and they were being successful. One again. Mary Pierce moved in her seat. Yes, she was uncomfortable here in Berger's office. She watched as he took a seat behind his desk and looked into her eyes. I am here to learn anything that you know. I am looking into anyone who could have any information on who was behind this slaughter. I know that you have been involved in many demonstrations over the past few years and must have heard something from someone, he said to her, and then sat back and waited for her response. Hamilton looked at her and said, we will investigate this matter completely. I want you to take precautions though. These messages are very threatening and specific and my office is very interested in who is the author. The thing that worries me is that most of the letters, in fact all of the letters, have not been mailed. Each one has been found somewhere obvious to me. One of the notes had been placed in my purse. Mary told him. Gladys Livingstone had sat quietly in the office listening to her client and wondering why she hadn't trusted her with such information. She might have been able to find the guilty party herself. She wondered just how truthful Mary was being. Did she suspect who was sending these messages? Mary continued, I have done nothing but think of what has happened in the past few days. One of my friends, Sandy Lewis, had called me to tell me about the vote at the lodge. She is a friend of one of the members. She wouldn't tell me their name, but there was going to be a vote that night, as we all know. So her information was correct. What surprised me was the amount of news coverage that night. Every single station was there with news crews. That was something that I hadn't experienced often. This was a simple budgetary vote, not an active abortion. George Ramsey had been in interrogation all night. The questions had been fast-moving and very blunt. He had called his lawyer, but knew that he was not prepared for such a case. He needed the best. Yes, he knew that he could be found guilty of murder, and because he was there and one of the active shooters, he was now facing the possible death penalty. How on earth had he ever managed to get himself into such a spot? He had a life, a wife, kids, a home, a job, and now he had nothing. His wife wouldn't even accept his call. He had one other possibility, and as he picked up the phone to make another call, he took a deep breath. Gertie had come into the office that Sunday to help out her boss and friends. The phone had not stopped ringing, and as she wiped tear after tear from her face. She had worked for Perry Mason for years and had seen murders many times, but never so many at once. As Gertie tried her best to handle everything at the office, she had found herself feeling unsafe. She had locked the office door and taken to just answering the phone. But then came the call that she had not been prepared to take. The call was from George Ramsey and he wanted to talk to Perry Mason. She picked up the private line to the Mason house and made the call. She could not just transfer this call as she wasn't positive that her boss would like to speak to him. However, this was a choice that he would have to make. Della was in the office still studying the evidence that she had when the phone rang. She answered the phone and heard the excitement in Gertie's voice. Della took a deep breath and said, Perry, George Ramsey is on the phone and he wants to talk to you. Perry had dedicated his life to finding the truth and knew that sometimes he had to do things that other attorneys would not to find it. He was very emotionally involved in this case, though, and was not sure whether or not he wanted to talk to the man. But he was curious about what the man had to say. Della sat at the desk next to the man she loved and knew that he was going to be going down to the jail to speak to George Ramsey. She knew that he would, as she knew her husband better than anyone else. He wanted to know the truth and not be ruled by emotions. She went to get her coat. She was not being left at home for this interview. Perry smiled at his wife, and as the two stopped to tell Karen where they were going, she nodded with acknowledgement. They were on their way to the police station once more. This interview would affect them for life. Chapter 7. Time was not on Mary Pierce's side and she knew it. As she took a seat in the large, stark, manly professional office of the district attorney. She had never had the honor of meeting in such a professional place. Hamilton Berger was a professional who for the first time in many elections was facing a serious opponent. The man who was giving him serious contention is a shrewd man who had become famous as what the old school would have called an ambulance chaser. Brian Johnson had not touched on the subject of abortion during his campaign to become the new district attorney. Now he found himself in the midst of a political death possibility for his opponent Hamilton Berger. He needs to take a stance and make that stance now. Jerry Michaels had been busy with the business of running the Johnson campaign when he had heard of the shooting. Quickly he had gathered information on the people's wishes on the subject and most importantly Burger's past stances and how they could use those stances against him. Already they were giving Burger trouble. With the right publicity they could win this race. Hamilton had been on the phone most of the morning with his own campaign manager. He of all people understood the political death trap that he was facing. But he had always taken chances and this was going to be one of the toughest uphill battles he had ever faced and he was ready for the challenge. As much as she tried, Mary Pierce had never had anything to do with the violent protesters. Try and try again, she could not think of anyone that would have done such a horrific thing as attacking innocent people. This was not her type of protest. She was a gentle person, she had always thought. Sitting there with her lawyer, Mary Pierce had made the decision to answer all and any questions. She was innocent of anything that had happened that evening except for the people who were peacefully demonstrating outside. As Della and Perry pored over the information in the folder, it became clear to them that this was all proof of an affair that it was time for Jerry Michaels to find out everything he could about Burger and his stand on the abortion issue. Anything that he could find against Burger was a plus on his side. He had an insider in the office of the district attorney and call her right. Jenny Vincent had worked in the district attorney's office for 20 years and had seen different attorneys come and go. She had not been fond of the way Burger had run the office. She had gone right to work on that Sunday, looking into any file that had anything to do with mass shootings or abortion. Burger was a real stick in the mud and had been very clear on how to handle murderers, but he had lost case after case to that attorney Perry Mason, and she found a case that he had done very badly at. Yes, it had been 4 years since they had completed that case and Burger was new at his job. The case had not been half as notorious as this had been, but 5 people had died in a drive-by shooting. The police had done a good job of the investigating, but they had gotten the wrong man. The man that Burger had charged with the shooting had been a young black man and the shooting had been done by a gang from Vietnam. It had nearly cost him his job as there had been riots for days after the public had found out the truth. As Jenny sat there and emailed her friend at Hamilton Burger's opponent's office, she smiled. The information in the folder was confidential and perhaps it would help get another district attorney into the office. She would have to dig deep into anything about abortion. She hadn't seen or heard anything regarding her boss's stance on abortion. He would have to take a stand one way or another now. Lori and Mike came over to see Sue. She was such a trooper and had made her coffee. As the two sat down at the table, Jen came into the room. Paul's mother looked as though she had been crying and was trying to keep up a good face. Lori picked up a broom and started to do some housework. Sue and Jen were on their way to the funeral home to make arrangements. As Paul II, as he had been called, sometimes came down the stairs, he was glad to see his Aunt Lori and Uncle Mike. They had been a part of his life for as long as he could remember. The two went out to the backyard to the pool and silently spent a few hours swimming. Although nothing was said out loud as the two spent the afternoon together, somehow Paul knew that everything was going to be okay. Back at the Mason household, Della and Perry were very busy. They had to force themselves to watch the video where their friends had been killed. It was a horrific sight to see, but every single scene had to be examined carefully. Della found the tape very difficult to watch and went back to the folder. She was sure that there was something in there that would at least give them the name of the person that was their friend's love interest. Perry watched with the carefully trained eye the carnage as it had unfolded. He watched as each man lifted their gun and began to shoot. It looked as though the men had targets and the shootings were not accidental. He watched as the men walked by certain people and took aim at others. He knew most of the people by name, but not all. He watched as Paul was shot. He was shot just a millisecond before he had time to shoot one of the killers. He now knew which of the men had killed his friend, and the man was dead now too. Della looked over at Perry to see him staring at the screen. She was being so thoughtless. Her husband was going through the same thing she was, and it was time she started to support him more. She walked over to her husband and put her hands on his shoulders. The poor man was watching as the man aimed and shot his best friend. Paul had been for all intents and purposes dead when he had hit the floor. He never opened his eyes again or anything. He lay on the floor alone, bleeding. The scene was just horrific and she was thinking of herself. She cried inside for everyone, herself, her friends, and any future that these people would no longer have. Sue, her baby, would never know his or her father. Chapter 7, Chapter 8. Sue Drake was standing next to one of her best friends, Lori. They were in Paul's closet trying to figure out what outfit he would be buried in. Paul's smell was on the clothes and it was all Sue could do to choose his outfit that he would wear forever. She needed to find the perfect tie too. Paul did not look any different as he had been wounded in the chest. Jen had meant to help, but she just couldn't bring herself to looking into what her son would wear for his burial. Just 2 days ago he had been alive and well. They had talked just the night before and Paul had been in a very upbeat mood. Now, he was dead along with so many others. Just last night had been her son's last in this life. Paul Sr. was busy at the newspaper office and was finding more and more information that was proving to be very informative. There had been several other instances where protests on abortions had been becoming more and more violent. As he read through the archives, he found that what had happened had been brewing for a long time. As Paul Sr. and his friend piled through more and more papers, they found many photos. What they needed to do was find someone who might be in the background. Perhaps not at the demonstration themselves, but someone who might have some influence in the political world. Both men were sure that the leader was a powerful person and they were going to discover who it was. L.T. Anderson had just gotten back to investigating. He had stayed up until way past 3 a.m. the night before and 7 a.m. had come very early. He was used to working nights and weekends, but this had taken an emotional toll on him also. He was going through some of the evidence when he got a call from Hamilton Berger. Mary Pierce was being targeted in the weeks prior to the shooting. Berger wanted the matter to take priority and be investigated immediately. L.T. Anderson was on it. He wanted to know who was involved also. George Ramsey had been glad to hear Perry Mason agree to meet with him. He knew that his life was in extreme danger and he worried about his ex-wife and children as well. Everyone hated him and he was in a safe place in the jail, solitary for now. As he took a seat in the interrogation room, he met Perry and his wife Della. He had seen them on television and in the newspapers many times and recognized them right away. Perry looked at the man who had done so many horrible things and wondered what would make a man, a father, a son, do such a horrific thing. He knew that he had not shot Paul, but he had shot many other innocent people just 24 hours ago and he wanted to know why. Della watched the unassuming man walk into the room. There was nothing about George Ramsey that would draw your attention to him. He was a cold-blooded killer, though, and she wanted to hear what he had to say. George shook both of their hands and started to talk. I know that right now I am the devil in your and everybody else's eyes. What I did was a well-thought-out act and I admit that. However, the carnage surprised me. I did not shoot or kill all of the people in the lodge. There were 2 of us shooting and we had been admitted into the lodge by someone. Perry Mason had been listening while Della had been taking notes. You have told me nothing that I don't already know. Why did you call me and ask me to come here? The chair that was provided in the jail was uncomfortable at the least, and those piercing eyes of Perry Mason was making George even more uncomfortable. He looked down for a second and then said, I need an attorney, one that can find out the truth. I know that you are the best and I would like you to represent me. George looked for some sort of sign that would indicate what his answer was, but Mr. Mason was well trained and showed nothing. After a moment, Perry Mason spoke. I cannot represent you because of my emotional involvement in this case. However, I do know that you have a good attorney and perhaps I could give him some advice if it is needed. Perry told him with a very stern face. Tomorrow when I appear in court, will you appear as a person who is interested in the truth to come out? George asked. Perry Mason was proud of his record as a defense attorney. He had worked his entire adult life to make sure that justice was served. Most of his clients were wrongfully accused, but he had defended a few that were guilty. He always felt that everyone is entitled to a fair trial. He thought for another moment and said, I will appear in court tomorrow as a person of interest. Della was not surprised by the words she heard. She knew that her husband was dedicated to finding out the truth, but she knew that it would be the toughest case that he would ever be involved in. As for her, she would have thought twice about helping the man, but she would do what she could to help. If they did not catch the real culprit, justice for Paul and the others would not be served. He was a determined man and she was a determined woman. They were going to find the responsible person if they had to look under every rock. Perry looked at George and said, I want to know everything. How did you find Mark Washington? Where did you get the guns and ammunition? Why did you buy that old Ford? Who gave you the funds? Those are the questions I want answered immediately. He watched the man squirm a little and then listened intently to what he had to say. Buying the car was just like making a statement. We wanted to be easy to find. Actually, we were both surprised that we made it home with no police chase. We had hoped to be chased by the police, with the police chase being shown over and over on the television and internet. We were looking for our moment of fame before we faced long prison sentences, but no one followed us. We both had guns already, but Tom had purchased a couple of new ones, and when I asked him where he got the money, he said from a friend. He would not elaborate. Tom knew Mark from before, and Mark had mentioned what they were going to be discussing that night. I don't think Mark had any idea that we were going to shoot anyone. Perry left knowing that he was going to have to do some digging on his own. He was going to go talk to George's ex-wife. Maybe she had some ideas. Della watched as her husband climbed behind the steering wheel and said, "This is going to be a long day." Chapter 8, Chapter 9. All was going as it should, and Perry knew that he was looking at a long, hard journey. For the first few hours after the shooting he had been focused on the death of his best friend. He now knew who had shot who, as did the police. What they did not know was who was responsible for the many deaths. As Perry and Della went through the many obituaries and saw so many families that would never be the same, he took a further oath. No matter what, he was going to find out who had been the organizer of the most horrific act he had ever witnessed. He thought of the many trials that he had assisted with the prosecution of the Nazis. He had thought that there was no such thing as that much cruelty in the world. Somehow he had thought that with the death of those people things would be different. What had happened at the lodge had brought back those memories and taught him that there would always be evil in the world. He was determined to make the change, small as it is in this world, through the courtroom. Hamilton Berger was so busy with the media and the investigation of the count of 19 dead and 12 injured. There was still a chance that a few would not survive, as it had only been a couple of days and several were still listed as critical at the hospital. But Mary Pierce, something about those phone calls was bothering him. Someone thinks that she knew something and was attempting to convince her to keep her mouth shut. She was not a person who frightened easily, and she was clearly scared. He had a huge amount of work ahead of him, and it was going to be tomorrow that the first hearing would take place. L.T. Anderson was now watching the tapes of the demonstration outside. There were hours that needed to be watched, and as he and Sergeant Blake studied each and every moment, they took notes of every single car that went by. Fortunately, the lodge had a very good system installed, and most of the cars would be easily identified as he could read the license plates. Each of the license plate would have to be run and each and every one of the people interviewed. Also, he wanted to look at every car that had gone by Mary Pierce's. She lived in a small neighborhood and the road was not well traveled. Perhaps something could be found there. She had consented to a wiretap being placed on her phone, and he had hopes that would work. Paul Sr. had been at the newspaper office all day long when he had finally headed back to his son's house. It had been a long day, and he had some names that he found interesting mentioned in many articles. But tomorrow was court, and he would not miss that for anything. It would be months before anything happened in the courtroom. He still had time. Monday morning came, and Della, Perry, Paul Sr., Jen and Sue all headed to the courthouse. Paul's son and Sally had wanted to go too, but they had finally agreed to stay with Karen. Della hoped that Sally would be spared court, as she had been a witness to her shooting one of the assassins, but Della knew that if she was needed she could be called. The Masons were used to media coverage, and as they came to the courthouse, even they were surprised by the coverage that was being held on that morning. Everyone was there: newspapers, television, radio, and pro-abortion and anti-abortion demonstrators. Perry couldn't help but notice that Mary Pierce was there bright and early. There was a crowd lined up on the sidewalk, all waiting for a chance to see the man who had shot and killed all those people. There must have been over 500 people trying to get into a courtroom that would hold possibly 60. The court and police officers found themselves asking for identification as each and every one of them came in. The courthouse was only large enough to allow officers and immediate family members of the victims in. Perry had agreed to stand in the courtroom and make sure that everything was going to go the way it legally should. He had made it his life's work to be sure that everyone got a free trial, and he had to put his personal feeling aside. He knew that by law George Ramsey could be charged with each and every count of murder. That he accepted, but someone had masterminded what had happened, and Perry believed that George was in mortal danger. He knew that the court would do their best to provide for his safety, but he was in danger even in solitary. As the friends made their way up to the courthouse, the media dived upon them with the determination of a mother lion protecting her cubs. No comment was all Perry said as he took Sue and Della's arms and rushed up the steps. Once inside, he was met with more chaos. There were people lining the hall as they were checked once more for any weapons and identification. The group finally made their way into the courtroom. The courtroom was hushed as people had been warned that one outburst of any kind and they would not be allowed back into the courtroom at all. Hamilton Berger had expected to see Perry Mason that morning, but when he saw him and Della take their seats next to the defendant, it had been all he could do not to drop his jaw. He had seen everything, Now he thought. Each and every charge was read and each charge was entered into the court log. I ask the court to provide no chance for bail as there are more charges pending. There has been one more death as of this morning, bringing the toll up to 20 dead now. Perry Mason sat there with no emotion on his face. Although, he did wonder who the new victim was. He had been friends with each and every one of the victims and their families. Now, he was going to have to find out who was responsible without his best friend to help. Paul Sr. would be the one that would be his investigator now. George Ramsay watched Della as she took her notes. She was very proficient and like her husband showed absolutely no emotion. As he listened to the list of the dead he put his head down. How could I have done this? He would ask this of himself for the rest of his life, a short one at that he was sure. Bail was denied and Perry watched as George Ramsay walked out of the courtroom. He took Della by the arm and walked over to Hamilton. He knew that Hamilton was surprised to see him, but knew that in his heart Hamilton understood. He was an attorney also, and everyone deserved a fair trial and all those families needed to know the truth. Chapter 10. Perry, I was surprised to see you in the courtroom sitting with the defendant. Are you planning on representing him? Berger asked his friend and often competitor in the courtroom. Della watched as her husband kept his staunch face and said everyone is entitled to a good defense and I am here for the truth. There is someone else involved in this and I am working to find out who the ringleader is. If I need to find it in a court of law, that is how it will be. The next few days were so busy. There was Paul's funeral and then the funeral at the lodge for each of the victims. Day after day Perry, Della and Sue Drake attended some funeral or mass. The toll on their emotions was unbearable. Victim after victim came up to Perry and asked him not to represent George Ramsay. Many were very emotional about it and he had kept his composure. By the end of the week they had all attended 23 funerals and Della had joined a group that was planning on some kind of honor for those that had lost their lives on that fateful night. She had been happy to find that her sister Lori had joined the group, and was proud to see Jen and Sue back to work and aiding with the huge task of rebuilding their lives. But it was back to work for everyone. Paul Sr. opened the door to the office that had been his office for so many years. He had been proud of his son and the hard work that had made the Paul Drake Agency a well-respected one. His son had worked hard at making sure that the truth was always found. As he walked in he was met by Paul's staff. Tom had been Paul's right-hand man for years and he had been running the agency since the shooting. He had been hard at work himself finding out who had been responsible for the act that had killed his friend and boss. He had been proud of the people at the agency. Each one of them had been able to put most of their emotions in control and had gone about investigating. As Paul went into his son's office he took a look at his desk. There on the desk were his pictures and his awards were all over the wall. Paul had received so many awards throughout his life and now they were all part of history. It was a sad day for his father and as he and Tom started to pack some of his son's personal belongings the two men talked. The efficiency with which Paul and his team had worked was still very much intact. The moment that Tom had found out about the shooting he and his men had gone to work on finding out who was responsible for the carnage. They had men all over the country and several were investigating other hot spots on the issue of abortion and the many other cases of bombings at clinics, threats to medical teams and the abuse of women who were seeking abortions. The anti-abortionists had been getting more and more violent as the years had gone by and a mass shooting had been a worry of the police for a long time. Unfortunately, it had not been will it ever happen, it had been when would it happen? Many of the acts had been done by random people, but many of the violent acts had been organized and his men were working on those acts. Tom had a man who was working in Boston who had joined an anti-abortion group as an insider. He also had a man in Atlanta working with another group. He had great hopes that his men would be able to find out some reliable information. Unfortunately, his men had to work slowly as they did not want to draw any attention to themselves. This was going to take time and patience on the part of the men. Gertie had been at her desk early the following Monday. Perry and Della had not been back to work in the office for a week now and there was a lot of paperwork that needed to be completed. She greeted her boss and wife with a smile and was greeted warmly. For Perry and Della going back to work was their medicine. It was tough as everyone once again expressed their condolences and it was all Della could do to stop from having the tears come again. But, Perry had taken her arm and smiled down at her and she drew on his massive strength. For Sally and Paul it was back to school. Sally had spent the last week with her best friend Paul and had watched the strength of her friend. He was a good friend and had listened to her with awe as she had told him about how they had hidden in the pool house and how her mom had shot and killed one of the shooters at the lodge. Karen was in the kitchen making breakfast when Paul had come over to wait for a ride to school. Sue and Jen were going over to the lodge for another meeting and had not been able to take him that morning. Paul was young and was bouncing back. He thought of himself as the head of household now. Karen was amazed at the resiliency of the two young children as they chatted as if nothing had changed. Perry Jr. sat there and chatted away with the energy of a young child. He jumped into the car and tried to put on his own car seat, happy to go for a ride in the car. Sue Drake knew that life would have to go on for the sake of her son and her unborn child. She hadn't told anyone that she was pregnant yet, but she knew that it was something that would have to be told soon. Her clothes were starting to get tight, and like she had been with Paul, she was going to start showing early. Because of all the strain and the worry from the shooting, Sue had made an appointment at the doctor's to make sure that everything was all right. She did not want to announce the pregnancy until she had seen the doctor. She had not liked lying about where she was going that morning, but it was for the best, and if everything was all right she would be telling them soon anyways. Jen had been surprised when Sue had told her that she had to make a stop and would be right back, and dropped her off at the lodge. She wondered if Sue was going to the doctor's and prayed that her grandchild was all right. As Sue sat in the doctor's office, the nurse listened for the heartbeat. She had never heard the heart before, as she was only 6 weeks along when she had last seen the doctor. Now, she was 8 weeks, and the nurse smiled as there it was. The doctor came in and checked everything. "Mrs. Drake, you can rest assured everything is fine. Just try to relax. I know that everything is stressful, but you want to keep calm for two of you now. I will see you in another month," and with a smile he walked out the door. Chapter 10, Chapter 11. As life settled at the Mason and Drake household, things began to change in the investigation into the person who was responsible for the act of terror had consumed both families and the city that terrible Saturday night. Each member of the family was dealing with it differently, and no one had been able to come up with who was behind this. Paul and Perry both worked most of their days, while Della decided that it was time for her to go out and do some of her own sleuthing. She thought that she would start with her paperboy. He had been there when she had fatally shot his father, and she hoped that he would be able to give her some insight. Maybe he will be able to connect something from a different angle, she thought to herself. Life at the Rogers house had not been the same since that terrible night. Sam had found himself in the role of the man of the home. His mom had been strong throughout the whole ordeal, but she was now going back to work. They needed the money, and he had cringed when the postman had handed him a letter that said certified. The letter had been from a lawyer's office. His mom said that they were being sued. That was enough to let Sam know that things were only going to get worse. Joanne Rogers had decided to finally contact Dana Ramsey. Prior to the shooting, the two had been good friends for quite a while. She knew that George had not been a good husband or father, and hoped that she could shed some light on what happened and why their two husbands had been so angry. She called Dana and they agreed to meet for a cup of coffee. At first they had thought about meeting at a small diner down the street, but in hoping that no one would be following them, they decided to meet at Dana's home. Paul Sr. had been watching the Rogers and Ramsey home from time to time, hoping to see someone show up, and that morning he got a surprise. As he watched from a few houses down, he watched Joanne Rogers enter the Ramsey home. The home where the Ramseys lived was a modest home with a small yard and lots of children for their children to play with. The house was neat, and Joanne could tell that Dana had been crying. She knew the feeling all too well, and as she sat down in the chair she waited for Dana to get her composure. But, much to Paul's surprise, he watched as after Joanne went inside, the back door of her car door opened. Out of the back seat came Sam Rogers. He looked around and then quietly ran towards the back of the house. Sam had been in his room when he had heard his mother on the phone with Dana Ramsey. He liked Mrs. Ramsey, and Steve Ramsey was one of his best friends. He knew what his mother was thinking and wanted to be a fly on the wall, so to speak. As his mother had gotten ready to go to the Ramseys' house, he had called Steve. They were both supposed to be at school that day, but this was a good day for Hookie. Ever since the shooting, both of their lives had been hell anyways. They had both been victims of unbelievable bullying and wanted some answers for themselves. Steve was waiting at the back of the house when Sam had come. They quietly made their way into the hallway where they could both listen. Dana had been going over and over what had been going on and looked at her friend. "I have thought of almost nothing but the shootings since that awful night. I have gone over and over in my head for some kind of clue of what was going on. The only thing that comes to my mind is that old car. It doesn't make sense why they would buy an old car and then use it to escape. The car reminded me of something my father once had. It was slow and made a lot of noise. The car would draw attention to them." Joanne had been thinking the same thing. The car was hardly something that someone that wanted to make a quick getaway would use. Why that car? Out loud Joanne said, where did they get that old thing anyways? Do you know? Why yes, the police said that it was bought at an old junkyard a couple of blocks from here. Some man named Nick Connors owned it. Dana told her and watched her face. Nick Connors. Where have I heard that name before? Do you know him? Or have you ever heard the name? She asked. Dana just shook her head. But Sam and Steve knew who Nick Connors was. They knew him well because they were always hanging around the old junkyard. They both wanted to find an old car and fix it. Maybe that is where his mother had heard the name, Sam thought. This was just another thing that brought guilt to Sam. If he and Steve had stayed away from the old junkyard, maybe his father wouldn't have known Nick. Paul had now made his way around the back of the house and was attempting to eavesdrop on the conversation himself. He could see the two women and hear what they were saying easily as the window was open right next to him. He listened as the word Nick Connors came up, and once again he had an eerie feeling. He was sure that he had seen that name in the paper. He would have to go over his notes. Della had been at the home office and knew that it was almost time for Sam to ride by on his bike and toss their newspaper on the lawn. She wanted to catch him on that day, so she went out on the front lawn and began to do some gardening. Sure enough, right on time, Sam came riding up on her bike. Sam, can I see you for a moment? Della called to the boy. Sam had been avoiding the Mason house ever since the shooting. He felt guilty for what he had put the Mason family through. If it hadn't been for him coming over that night and carelessly leaving his bike on the front lawn, his father might be still alive and the Masons wouldn't have had to go through what they did. He knew that Della had taken the fact that she had shot and killed a man devastatingly. Della smiled at the brave young man and asked him to take a seat on the front porch. Sam, I want you to know once again that what happened that night had nothing to do with you. It was your father who was at fault, Rajam Smith. I know that. Don't worry. I have something that you might find interesting though. My mom and Mrs. Ramsey were talking this afternoon and I listened to the conversation. I know it was wrong, but I have to know what happened. Della put her arm on his shoulder and gave him a hug. It's all right. Sometimes you have to go a little far to find the truth. Up until today I really hadn't thought much about the car that my father had bought. But, when they mentioned Nick Connors, it was as if a light went off in my head. One of the places I deliver the newspaper to is the lodge. One of my favorite places to go is the junkyard also. Steve Ramsey and I are hoping to one day rebuild an old car. When my mom was talking, I remembered something. One day I came into the lodge to pick up my paper money and Mr. Connors was there. He was kissing the lady that works in the office. Sam watched Mrs. Mason for any sign but saw nothing. Did you hear anything else? Della asked. Sam shook his head. I know this time has been very difficult. But, I promise things will get better. With that, Sam left once again to work on his paper route. Della waved to the young man as he rode down the street. Indeed, this was interesting information. Della now knew who the secret man was. Chapter 11, Chapter 12. The time had come for the Perry to go and do what he was best at. No matter how he tried, he knew that he was the one that was the most likely to be able to identify the ringleader. It was going to be a sensational trial and the media was making a mockery of justice once more. As he and Della walked out of the lodge one more time, he looked at his wife and gave her a big hug. Della had been Perry's best friend, partner and love for long enough. She knew what he was going to do. He didn't have to say anything. She smiled at him and gave him a peck on the cheek. Perry, let's get down to business and find that ringleader. It will be one of the few times that you defend someone that you know is guilty, but we must find out who his boss is, she told him. As the two walked hand in hand to the car, the world did not know what had just happened. The prospect of the truth coming out had just been improved 500%. Chapter 12, Chapter 13. The time had come for the Perry to go and do what he was best at. No matter how he tried, he knew that he was the one that was the most likely to be able to identify the ringleader. It was going to be a sensational trial and the media was making a mockery of justice once more. As he and Della walked out of the lodge one more time, he looked at his wife and gave her a big hug. Della had been Perry's best friend, partner and love for long enough. She knew what he was going to do. He didn't have to say anything. She smiled at him and gave him a peck on the cheek. Perry, let's get down to business and find that ringleader. It will be one of the few times that you defend someone that you know is guilty, but we must find out who his boss is, she told him. As the two walked hand in hand to the car, the world did not know what had just happened. The prospect of the truth coming out had just been improved 500%. Brian Johnson has been busy investigating all the angles that he was going to be able to take to his advantage. After all, his opponent Hamilton Berger was tightly involved with many members at the lodge. He was well aware of the friendship between him and Perry Mason. He also knew of the death of Mr. Mason's best friend. It was now going to be H. Brian's campaign office had made a public announcement regarding the slaughter at the lodge that night. He had made sure that he had made a great point of showing how the policies in the current district attorney office had led to such a dangerous and deadly situation. Not only had he pointed that out, he made sure that in the political eye of the general public whose opponent Hamilton Berger appeared to be indecisive are such an important issues as abortion. He had publicly stated that if the district attorney's office had taken a stronger stance they would not have been a need for so many demonstrations and violence. He had yelled to a rally of many hundreds that the blood of the victims was on the district attorney's hands. But at this very moment things appeared to be playing into his hands. There was a huge outcry among the public for justice to be swift. As a matter of fact, it was near mob rule. How's the days of past, he had made sure that the public heard every single name of the people who had died that night, including family members who would never have the same life again. As he sat in his office, his secretary came into the room and told him there was something on the television that he should see it. Yes, he turned the television on. He watched in amazement as the lodge appeared on the screen once more. There on the screen was the announcement that the man who had sold the automobile to the two terrorists was having an affair with the secretary at the lodge. He watched as the reporters relentlessly asked questions to the two people who were probably doing anything but having an affair outside of their marriage. It must be very important that it appears that Brian Johnson was well aware of what the police were finding out what day he was going to make sure that justice was done quickly and efficiently, even though the district attorney's office had different ideas. After all, this was politics, and the brightest and most convincing men would be the winner in the political arena. The most honest and forthright were not always the winner. Gary Michaels had been at the campaign office when the news had broken and come over the television telling the news that Nick Connors, the man that had sold the car to the two terrorists, was having an affair with the secretary at the lodge. This was the kind of information that his team needed to further steer the reputation of the current district attorney. Perry Mason and his wife Debbie headed home. They were now going to have to bring their information together and attack the questions, but they needed answers from a different point. Because of the news and the frenzy that the news had caused, they no longer had an ace in the hand, so they call it. In the meantime, tell me why I was on Connors from themselves in the embarrassing situation I've been discovering having an extramarital affair. This could not be any more public and any more embarrassing that you don't want to damn could have ever imagined. They both had husbands and a wife at home. Neck that of his children, and what is the indiscretion had cars and done to them. As Hamilton Berger said it to decide how he was going to handle the situation that was brewing, once again at the lines his phone rang. On the phone, what is the wife of Nick Connors? She wanted to meet with Mr. Berger in the morning. She made it very clear that she did not want anyone else to know that she would be meeting him. Privacy was of the essence, she had stated very firmly. Hamilton was quick to agree to her terms. He had no way of knowing how much information she had, if any. He also knew that he could not force her to testify against her husband. But with the news and the very public affair between her husband have a secretary at the lodge, perhaps she was not going to make life easy for her husband. There is nothing worse than a woman's revenge. That was something he knew very well. Lieutenant Anderson have been very busy interviewing each and every victim and family member, even people who had provided food for the logs at night. He had been written very thorough. I had come up with very much information. He knew that everything had to be gone through with a fine-tooth comb, because just one small statement might totally crack the case. He knew that the two men were not the one leader. Someone else with a lot of money and a lot of political pull has something to do with the murders. He was determined to make sure that the guilty people were found and brought to justice. There was something very disturbing about the news that he was watching. It did not appear to him that the kind of information that was being released would have any lasting results on the ultimate reason of the investigation. He was sure that someone else was pulling the strings and making sure that he was distracted. Although he would give me the information the importance that it deserves, he was not swayed. Somewhere in his study, what was a mass murderer who felt safe as he found someone to do his dirty deeds. He shut the television off and made his way to his office to read more information about the DNA of the victims once again. Gladys Livingston had been sitting back and doing her best to keep a level head in the chaos that had happened in her life. She had gone to school to help, had become involved with the movement regarding abortions some 5 years ago when a young girl who had lived in her building had died during an illegal abortion. She had found herself pregnant and her boyfriend had denied being the father. She had gone to what people call a backyard abortion that had been treated by a doctor who had lost his license to practice medicine. During the procedure she had began to bleed, and by the time they had decided to finally call an ambulance and had been too late. The young girl had died on the way to the hospital. She had already been 19. Now this business of Nick Connors and Terry Wallace had once again opened a whole new can of worms. Gladys thought of that young girl in the dilemma of being pregnant and how quickly one's life can change in an instant. She had been going through some of her old papers and he found some information that she found very interesting. She picked up the phone and made a call. This call was made to her colleague Perry Mason. It was time that they spoke again. Chapter 13, Chapter 14. Life since the shooting at the lights at night had been hard, and many people not to be forgotten was Chris Washington. Chris Washington had her life that night. Her night had ended as much as her husband's life had. No longer was Chris welcome at the lodge or anywhere. It seemed that everyone blamed her husband for what has happened that night. She knew in her heart that he had been involved and had spent every waking moment trying to remember anything that happened that would have resulted in her husband deciding to get involved in such a dangerous and brutal happening. She and her 2 children have now found themselves outside of every social circle in the city. Now as she stood in her husband's office she was overwhelmed by the emotion that was flowing through her. There have been so many officers who had gone through every single item in her husband's desk, but there was still so much that she needed to take care of on her. In the week since the shooting, George Ramsey had had plenty of time to contemplate what he had done. Before the shooting, his life with him and his wife had basically been over. He had not been a good father and had let his emotions take over. Now his wife and his children never came to see him. He had loved Dana so much at one time, and now his life with her was over. As George Ramsey sat in the cell with absolutely nothing to do except contemplate the horrors of that night, a jail guard came in and told him that Perry Mason was there and he wanted to talk to him. At this point Perry Mason was almost the only person that he got to speak to. He had been in protection at jail and in solitary since Sunday he had been arrested. Finally he thought to himself that perhaps there was some kind of good news. He knew that he faced a long prison term and possibly even the death penalty. But as it turned the corner and went into the witness room, he saw Perry Mason and his secretary's wife Della. Perry Mason have been surprised when he'll get in the call from Gladys Livingstone. It had crossed his mind that perhaps she was not being totally open with him on the information that she had. But sometimes that happened if there was not enough trust between people. This was a very tough case and she had her ethics that she had to consider. Perhaps she needed to speak to her client Mary Pierce before she took the steps to speak to him. Gladys Livingstone had indeed been thinking very much about the crimes in the floor at the Y. She had contemplated I am dying over and over about everything that you may have seen or that would be pertinent to that case. Yes, she was a supporter of her portion right, but she was not a supporter of anyone who would Joanne the murder and slaughter of so many. Sometimes something happens that triggers a memory. This is what has happened as Gladys watched the television and see the scene where the media had basically stormed the lodge with the information about the affair between Nick Connors and the secretary at the lodge. Mary Pierce had tried to pick up the pieces and continue on with her life. The demonstrations that she frequently attended, however, were no longer considered just part of her life. She was very cautious who she spoke to and who she allowed to attend any rallies that she was involved in. She knew that she was being overly cautious, but she also knew that someone was stalking her. It has been Mary's hope that Paige confronting the district attorney with the information and the police coming around your home many times a day harassment would stop. But that had not been the case. She now found herself receiving threats to do 3 times a day sometimes. When she called the district attorney's office, she received a sympathetic ear but had received no help. She found herself alone and on her own. If I get to the point that even her neighbors considered her to be partially responsible for what had happened that night. When she went outside of her home, neighbors would always been friendly, would turn their head and not speak to her. It was then that her phone rang one more time. Mary did not have the energy to pick up the phone but knew that it might be important. There was always a chance that the call was a regular call, so she picked up the phone and listened. Once again she heard that gruff voice on the other end. This time the voice scared her even more. The voice is definitely a male and it said, "You have taken a dangerous step forward in your contacts with the district attorney's office. I know that you have told them about my phone calls. You have been warned to stay away and have not listened. Now you have taken the step I know of. Are you come protect you from the person that has all intentions of giving you great bodily harm. This is a large group who has many friends and will not hesitate to murder your family or you. The district attorney's office has no power against us. This is your final promise and warning. As Mary was up the phone, she was shaking so bad that she dropped the receiver. This was no longer a subtle threat, this was been a threat to her and her family. The man on the phone did not seem to care that he was scaring her to death. Now he once more was threatening his power was to be used to harm even her friends and family once again. She thought what he had said and knew that perhaps going to the district attorney was no longer an option. For the first time she was sure that there was some kind of plant inside the office. She sat in her favorite chair, just concentrated once more. There has to be an answer somewhere, she thought to herself. She knew that she knew something that no one wanted as her to tell. She knew that she had to go over every single thing that she had done the past few months and find the key to what information she knew. It was your only protection now. Not only did she have to figure the puzzle out for herself but for her family also. Tim Cook was still at home recovering from his injuries. With physical therapy he was going to be able to go back to his job once more as a police officer in a few more weeks. But the emotional scars were much deeper than the physical. That night would have a profound effect on his life until the day he died. The horrors of that night met with him in his dreams each and every night. Sleep had become a nightmare and he had sought the help of a good psychiatrist. Over and over he went over what he has seen in his mind. He had been questioned by many officers and detectives, the district attorney and many others, but had not been able to give them any additional information. He was said to admit to himself that he had blocked many of those memories from that night from his mind. But with the help of a good counselor he had been able to bring some of the memories back. He hoped that someday he would be able to remember everything and perhaps help with the investigation. But for now he had to concentrate on getting better.